Are you not able to see my screen?
There it goes. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, awesome. Okay, well, I'm assuming we're recording now. So welcome to our part 1 of 2, Office of Management and Finance, BRFS presentation on internal controlled standards. Brought to you by the GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office Green Book. And we'll show you what that looks like later. This is the September 2014 revision, which is, I believe, the most current one that we have. So today we'll be presenting Ron Vaught, controller, and myself, Cynthia Carlisle, accountant for at the City of Portland. So Ron, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The Green Book is basically the federal government takes the COSO framework and kind of converts it into what works for government as opposed to the private sector, which is why we're using the Green Book as opposed to the COSO stuff. So yeah, anyway, that's the why behind looking at the Green Book, is it's a governmental version of the COSO framework.
Okay. And so, Ron, my thought was, since we're going to be just kind of interchanging back and forth, and you're online and I'm in person, just feel free to jump in whenever. And if it feels natural, you can speak over several slides. I'll go ahead and get us started with the overview. So first, we're going to start off with what is internal control. Internal control is a process used by management to help an entity achieve its objectives. So kind of the 3 main things in there is that it is basically a process, and they're designed, implemented, and monitored by management. So management takes over or takes ownership of these processes. And the point of it is to help the entity achieve objectives, which we're going to go into here. There's basically the 3 objectives, which have to do with running operations efficiently and effectively, reporting reliable information about operations, and complying with applicable laws and regulations. Okay. And there are 5 components. And each one has various principles, which we'll do a deeper dive into. And the 5 components have to do with control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. So if you've ever taken the CPA exams, when you take your audit exam, you basically have to memorize this, and you have to be able to map each and every single one of the principles to each and every single one of the, components. So you become very, very familiar with this. And I did kind of just want to point out that if you look at it from control environment down to monitoring, there's more principles stacked at the top. So there's more principles around the control environment and risk assessment. So we'll be spending a majority of our time looking at those. Those are really, really important, and they kind of encompass all areas of the entity. And each principle has important characteristics called attributes. So first, we're going to touch on some of the fundamental concepts. You'll notice throughout the presentation that we're going to kind of come back around and continue to touch on these in different layers of detail. So first, we'll kind of start off really, really high level. So some of the fundamental concepts include that internal control is a process affected by an entity's oversight body, management, other personnel that provides reasonable, not total, but reasonable assurance that the objectives of an entity will be achieved. And again, some of those objectives, there's 3 basic categories. There's operations, which tells you about the effectiveness and efficiency of an organization. The reporting aspect, which is the reliability of internal and external reporting. Compliance, which is generally compliance with laws and regulations. And again, we'll get into deeper layers of that later in the presentation, but we'll leave it there for now. Also, internal control comprises plans, methods, policies, and procedures used to fulfill the missions, plans, goals, and objectives of the entity. And it's also the first line of defense against safeguarding assets, which, especially in government, we have the public, they're placing their trust in us to safeguard, the assets of the city. They belong to the city, so it's kind of a big deal. I kind of love that we have that there. So, right. Moving on. So still under this high-level fundamentals umbrella, we also have a thought that internal controls is a continuous built-in component of operations. So in theory, any time that you're looking at something that's operations facing, you should be able to map a certain process to an internal control and procedure behind that. As I mentioned before, it provides reasonable, not absolute assurance that the entity's goals will be achieved. There's always, if you look at the fraud triangle, if you're familiar with that at all, you are aware of something called collusion. And that would be an example of like an override of a control. And so even though your internal controls can be perfectly mapped out and designed very, very well, there's always a possibility for overriding of those controls. So that's why you can't offer absolute assurance. Let's see, management sets the entity's objectives. They are responsible for implementing the controls and evaluating the internal control system. So periodically monitoring those controls to make sure that they're working as intended. And personnel throughout the entity play important roles in an effective internal control system. So that means us. And everybody at all levels of the organization, we all play a really important role in ensuring that the processes are working smoothly, efficiently, and that we're safeguarding those assets. Let's see. So, right, internal controls increases the likelihood that an entity will achieve its objectives. Okay. So in talking about establishing effective internal controls, you have to first start off with a mission, a strategic plan, objectives, and a plan to achieve those objectives. Internal controls help the organization to achieve the objectives that they've set out to accomplish, essentially by having processes that map out to those objectives. And the Green Book, as Ron mentioned, which is this guy here. This is brought to you by the Government Accountability Office. This is like a pretty cool title, Comptroller General of the United States. I kind of am like tempted to look them up on LinkedIn. If they use that title, it's pretty cool. But it's basically based off of this book here. So this is our standards for internal control in the federal government. September 2014. And we're going to be diving into this cube graphic here mostly, but if you were ever curious, this is about 86 pages of really great reading. And it does go into very, very great depth about all these things that we'll be talking about here today. But and that's what this is talking about. This Green Book uses the hierarchical structure of 5 components and 17 principles. Okay, so a little bit of a roadmap into where we're going to be going today. Like I mentioned, we're going to be revisiting a lot of these topics kind of in more detail and more layers as we go through the presentation. It's a lot to take in, and I know some people that keep something similar to this graphic at their desk. to kind of remind themselves of how important internal controls are in everything that we do. And so this roadmap is basically the graphic taken from that, from the Green Book. And it kind of shows you how the levels of organization work together with the 3 categories of objectives that we talked about and the 5 components of internal control. So the objectives at the top being operations, so think efficiency and effectiveness. Reporting, think internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. Compliance, think compliance with laws and regulations. And on the right, you have the levels of organizational structure. And this is what I love because it really shows it from right to left, how it goes from function to the greater operating unit to the greater division, which flows up into the entity as a whole. And so, obviously everybody that works here is going to fit in somewhere there. And we all, we all have a responsibility to do our part, which I love. And then on the left-hand side, we have our 5 components. So again, starting at the top with that control environment, and then risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, which will, probably be larger as we enter even more into a digital hybrid stage, and monitoring. So that's kind of where we'll be going today. Ron, did you want to jump in and add anything?
So far, so good. For us, it gets really interesting because, like, if you take a manufacturing organization, for example, there isn't a whole lot of diversity in how the organization is put together. But for us, we've got police, we got fire, we got parks people, we got street people, we got people running the wastewater treatment plants, people running the dams for the Water Bureau. And each one of those is a very unique business all by itself. And so we've got a multitude of functions and a multitude of organization units and divisions all combined into one entity, which to me is one of the fascinating things about cities. I mean, I've worked a lot with school districts, and they're more concise. Everything they're doing is focusing on teaching. So they don't have quite as many functions. They do have some, because they usually have a food operation, and then special education and adult education, and then the regular K through 12. And then they also have grants to deal with. But they are a simpler type of organization. But cities are just really, really complicated. And that's part of what I find really fascinating about it. But it makes this internal control stuff more complicated because you have to come up with control. There's a multitude of different risk assessments and control environments and control activities, varying depending on what type of activity you're looking at. So anyway, it's a fascinating area.
Yes. And one thing I want to mention too is, Ron, in like what you were talking about, that kind of reminds me even as our like society is like changing, you mentioned like some of these like functions like police and such, how something like body cams, for example, like that could add another layer of complexity. Like you wouldn't necessarily think about that in like the accounting world maybe, but it does kind of add like another like food for thought for like control activities around that in like a different, like maybe like the operations aspect, which in like
Yeah.
what we do. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the whole police area, you have to uh, do a totally different type of risk assessment than you do if you're looking at street workers or working on the streets. Because it's just totally different types of risks. And
Mm-hmm.
you have to apply a different set of control environments like the body cameras.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, yeah, anyway, it's fascinating.
It is very fascinating. I think as accountants, we spend the majority of our time kind of, concerning ourselves with reporting, internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. We certainly do a really great job about, of doing this.
Hmm.
And also with, in terms of compliance, because a lot of times we're, calculating things or doing certain analysis to make sure that we're in compliance. With
Hmm.
compliance, I tend to think more about like our budgetary function. And, like we may be concerned with reporting on like a gap basis. But our budget people are concerned with making sure that we're not going over budget. And that has a little bit more to do with that law aspect. So they're
Yeah.
going to be looking at the same data, but with a different set of eyes. And so they're going to have a different set of internal controls to ensure that, they're not overspending or that they're getting the authorization that's needed before they proceed.
Hmm. And even within accounting, uh, move over to the operations section. They're constantly checking for compliance with city policies and laws. Uh, it's like travel. Uh, there,
Mm,
there are very specific rules about what you can get reimbursed for and how you
mhm.
go about getting reimbursed. Uh, it's amazes me how many people are buying food and trying to get the city to pay for it. But there are prescribed policies that dictate exactly when and how you go about doing that.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, we recently had one where somebody was trying to get us to buy alcohol for a party that they were wanting to have, and we had to put our foot down very firmly on that. Uh,
Right.
so the compliance thing is extremely varied, and you get into HR, and there are just tons of HR issues,
Mhm.
and making sure that we're treating our people fairly and equitably. Uh, you go over to the risk people, the workers' comp and liability people, and they have, well, I mean, just like the ergonomic stuff. Like when you start, you're supposed to talk to the ergo people and get a chair that's fitted to
Mhm.
you. So the compliance is just everywhere you turn. It's a big area, but it
Yeah.
all has to fit together in order to make sure that uh, employees are safe and the public is safe and that the resources are protected.
Mhm.
So anyway, it it it's not anywhere near as simple as it kind of looks with the cube, but because you can pick apart each one of those little things and come up with all sorts of stuff.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, thank you. With that, we can jump straight into these 5 components. And we're still in the high overview area, so we'll come back and revisit these in greater detail. So the 5 components of internal controls are going to be that control environment. This is the tone at the top that provides discipline and structure. Otherwise, people, would be trying to, like Ron said, get approval for an expense in a million different ways. Somebody can say, hey, I talked to Ron. Ron said it was fine. Somebody might provide an email. Somebody might provide just a receipt. So it's important to kind of have that discipline and structure coming from the top. Another component is the risk assessment component. We definitely touched on this quite a bit already, which is the basis for developing risk responses. This is going to be very focused in on particularly having to do with a function and what the risks in that particular function are. Obviously, like police are going to have different risks than we are in reporting. The third component is control activities. So this has to do with the actual policies and procedures to achieve those objectives and respond to those risks. The fourth one is information and communication. So this would be information used to support the internal control system. Monitoring, this is the assessment of the quality of performance over time and to promptly resolve those findings. So this is basically saying, like, making sure that someone is going back and ensuring that those procedures that we have in place are actually working effectively to achieve those goals that we set out to achieve. Okay, so still high level, these are the 17 principles of internal control. So as we went up here, we're going to be talking about 5 that pertain to control environment, 4 for risk assessment, 3 for control activities, 3 for information and communication, and 2 for monitoring. So control environment, this is the oversight body and management, their duty to demonstrate commitment to integrity and ethical values. They should be overseeing the control system. They should be establishing an organizational structure, appropriately assigning responsibility and delegating authority to achieve those goals. They should also demonstrate a commitment to recruit, develop, and retain competent individuals. That could be very dangerous. If you hire someone who is not competent to do their job, then you can't really expect them to reasonably carry out those objectives. Management should evaluate performance and hold individuals accountable. So we'll dive into those a little bit deeper later. Principles under the risk assessment are management defines objectives to enable identification of risks and define tolerances. Obviously, you can't look at everything, but you should be able to competently define those tolerances. Management also identifies, analyzes, and responds to risks related to those defined objectives, considers the potential for fraud. That always scares me, and I feel like, oh my God, I could never. But when we touch on the fraud triangle, it's actually not hard to see how, any human could be susceptible to it under the right circumstances. So it's important to always be paying attention to that. And management also identifies, analyzes, and responds to significant changes that could impact the internal control system. So like we mentioned before, with the evolving of certain aspects of operations also comes the need to reanalyze and respond to those changes in a way that, like, we make sure that our internal controls are matching and keeping up with new operations or changes in operations or changes in technology, things like that. Economic changes, a whole slew of things. Okay, so control objectives include management designing control activities to achieve those objectives and respond to risks. They are responsible for designing the information system and related control activities and the implementation of control activities through policies. So like Ron mentioned, that alcohol example, like we probably should have that as a policy. We probably do, but okay. So information and communication. Management uses quality information to achieve objectives. They communicate internally the necessary information to achieve those objectives and communicate externally as necessary the information needed to achieve those objectives. And finally, monitoring. So this is management establishes and operates activities to monitor the internal control system and evaluate the results, and then remediates any identified deficiencies in a timely basis. And I think this one is really important. In a way, I think management kind of has to monitor themselves, making sure that they're monitoring themselves to monitor. Because when you do have like deficiencies or some sort of failure in a control, it doesn't really do a lot of good if you don't address it in a timely manner. And it's really easy, I think, then for people later to say, oh, well, we've always done it this way, or, well, I've done it this way before and they've accepted it's never been a problem. And that's kind of how you can have a breakdown in the tone at the top if management isn't sort of paying attention to those things and responding timely. Okay, so just to bring it back around, this is, again, the 5 components that we've just talked about from the top to the bottom, and from right to left, the different levels that it impacts all the way up through the entity and the 3 different categories of objectives. Ron, do you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, we're heading into a period of change where we're going to have to be really thinking about our control systems and policies and how they need to evolve. So Summer has gotten involved with the Charter Commission reorganization, and their plan at the moment is to, by Halloween, to have figured out what our new org structure should be, and then to start designing the underlying data, the cost objects and fund structures and everything that will allow us to evolve into the new organization that we're going to become. And then for the FY 25 budget, which is the one that we'll be working on next winter, that we will be budgeting into that brand new organizational structure. And that's going to have to, we're going to have to do new risk assessments and set up new control systems. So we're going to have a really great opportunity. And then simultaneously with that, we're in the process now of implementing Ariba, which is will replace, currently we use BuySpeed as our procurement tool, and Ariba will be the replacement to BuySpeed. And everybody that buys stuff to the city will be doing it through Ariba. So that will be a whole brand new control system. How that one will impact us is that right now, vendors like email their W-9s and an ACH form and a copy of their canceled check so that we can set them up as vendors, which has all sorts of control problems and risks. But with Ariba, we will have a vendor portal where the vendor will actually go in and create their own vendor setup and attach their W-9 and their ACH form and a copy of their canceled check. And all of that stuff will be put into the portal and won't be going to the bureaus, and should give us much better control over all that vendor data. And then once Ariba is done, then we'll be moving to the S4 implementation so the new version of SAP, which will again bring all sorts of new functionality to us, but it'll require us doing new risk assessments and establishing new control environments. So we're heading into a really fascinating era here, where we're going to be reevaluating who we are as an entity and how all these systems work. So I think it's exciting, and I'm fascinated to see how it all comes together.
Yeah. I was glad that you talked about Ariba, because I was kind of curious about that and who's going to be essentially kind of like poking holes in that. I recall like last summer we had an instance where a bad actor got away with some fraud by essentially well, I guess doing a really good job of convincing somebody within the organization that there needed to be a change in, I believe it was like the ACH information. So I kind of wonder how, like, who's going to be testing it? Like, will there be, some sort of frequency where somebody will just kind of go through and like revalidate vendors? Are we still using them? Because there could be a risk that a vendor just uploads an invoice, and it's just all too easy to go ahead and process those invoices without verifying that the work was done or that it was authorized.
Yeah, that'll have to be some kind of control that, well, can just anybody log on to the system and create that themselves as a vendor,
Right.
and
Or
then try to submit a fictitious invoice and get it processed.
Right, or even a legitimate vendor duplicating invoices. I think sometimes we think like, oh yeah, we pay, XYZ vendor all the time for, such and such work. But it's whether it's intentional, if they have bad intentions, they are trying to get paid twice for the same work, or some sort of, we would have to have some sort of system in place where we know, nope, that work has been done and that work has been accounted for and that work has been paid for.
Yeah, and there's variations on that too, because like we're starting to do work with procurement cards, P cards, and looking for internal control violations. So like if you're going to spend over $10,000 with a vendor for a specific thing or project, you have to go through the procurement process. But if it's under $10,000, you can pay for it with a P card. So
what happens if it's a series of $9,999 transactions?
exactly. Yeah. So,
sorry, this is like where I thrive. I love, like, okay, well, if I was going to be a bad actor, how would I get around those controls?
yeah.
Which is why I find this stuff so exciting. So thank you all for coming to our TED Talk.
Well, and then the ACL software, that when we do hire a compliance person that they'll be using, that goes in and uses complex statistical processes to look at data sets. So like we'll be able to plug that software into the P-card database and do analysis like that. Are we getting $9,000 payments to the same vendor in a short period of time? And is that really an attempt by whoever did it to circumvent our control systems and the procurement process?
Yes. Or attaching, like a software agreement into something that isn't like in procurement that doesn't really belong there, these little, like, tacking on these little add-ons.
Yep. So anyway, we need to be doing more work like that, but we need to get our compliance person on board and have them start working on that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
We've got,
I love that.
there's a ACL city auditor's office has a plug-in to SAP. So we can kind of piggyback on what the city auditor has and actually plug ACL into SAP and start running those types of analysis on the big database.
Ooh, yeah.
So anyway, all sorts of possibilities, and it's going to be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thank you for sharing.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to go through these next 15 slides a little bit quickly just to make sure that we're staying on target and to make sure that we have enough time for the practical input as thank you, Ron. Like, I really love that you shared that because that makes it super tangible. Okay, so now we're going to be discussing different roles in the internal control system. So there's the oversight body, which oversees the strategic direction of the entity. Of course, management, who's responsible for all the activities, including the design, implementation, and monitoring of the effectiveness of the control system. And personnel, which is us. We assist in that design, implementation, and monitoring. And we're also responsible for reporting issues noted in operations, reporting our compliance objectives. So this, of course, is sometimes on the technical side, just a matter of, bringing it to someone's attention and getting clarification on the matter. Maybe, something needs to get fixed. But Ron, also, you mentioned our internal auditor, who we haven't had a lot of experience talking to them, but I imagine that they're doing that on their end as well.
Yeah. Well, we should probably get together with him periodically. Tinson just got promoted, and we just got a new city auditor. So.
Oh, that's right. Mary Hull Caballero resigned.
Yeah, she didn't resign. Her term ran out. It's an elected position, so
Okay.
she decided not to run. If she had decided to run, I think she would have won again. She had enough and decided not to run again.
It's a big job.
Yeah, it definitely is. It would be an interesting one, though. I've never really done performance audits, but would be kind of interesting to learn about performance auditing.
Yes. Okay, so objectives of the entity. So management in conjunction with the oversight body sets objectives to meet the mission, strategic plans and goals, of course, within the framework of laws and regulations. You have to have those objectives in mind when you're designing the internal control system. And as part of that design, management defines the objectives in specific and measurable terms to meet those objectives. We covered this already, but in more detail, there's the 3 objectives of operations, reporting, and compliance. So the operations is linking those objectives to the entity, to the mission of the entity, and improving effectiveness and efficiency of those program operations. Reporting, again, internal and external stakeholders, and this can be financial and non-financial. So there's 2 different characteristics of data there, and compliance with laws and regulations, even in and especially in government. Okay, factors of an effective internal control system. It's to provide reasonable, not absolute assurance that we can meet those objectives. And each of the 5 components need to be effectively designed, implemented, and monitored. And they are operating together in an integrated manner. So there should be consistency in those policies and procedures. And if any of the 5 components and 17 principles is not effective in operating together, then the whole system as a whole cannot be effective. That's what that's saying. Okay, so now we're going to talk about evaluation of internal controls, which I think is really exciting. So management determines if controls individually and in combination are capable of achieving objectives and addressing related risks. So the question is, do controls exist and have they been implemented? A deficiency, so these are, we're getting into some of the details now, but a deficiency in design exists when a control necessary to meet an objective is missing, or an existing control is not properly designed. And a deficiency in implementation exists when a properly designed control is not implemented correctly. So the deficiency in design is just kind of like a failure, like maybe you have a policy, but it's entirely failing to meet the objective of why you have a policy. So you might have a policy, I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I don't know, maybe your policy is to get authorization for something before spending money, but the existing control is to log about it in, I don't know, in some diary that no one is authorized, like no one's reviewing for authorization. So that would be an example of a control that exists, but it's not really properly designed because the whole point of the control is to make sure that you get authorization before spending money. Whereas a deficiency in implementation exists when a properly designed control is not working correctly. So maybe you do have a policy that addresses this explicitly, saying you must get authorization before spending this money, except if the tone at the top isn't that great, or nobody's really collecting those reports or making sure that all the all the proper signatures are there, then it could be well designed, but just not really well carried out. So that's what that's talking about. Okay, so continuing on with evaluation, management evaluates the significance of a deficiency by considering the magnitude of impact, that is the likelihood of occurrence and the nature of the deficiency. Magnitude refers to the likely effect on, achieving, I think we left some stuff out there, probably achieving our goals, and the possibility of a deficiency impacting the entity's ability to achieve those objectives. What I think is interesting when we think about magnitude is we have to consider it in individual and in aggregate. So for example, is this kind of like a one-off situation, or is this something that is going to impact the organization at every single functional level? So that's when you think about the magnitude of the impact. When I learned about this in financial reporting, this could have to do with, say you don't have, say SAP lacks a control where, or whatever accounting system you're using lacks a control where if you're booking a journal entry that hits multiple entities, it may be balanced in whole, but not balanced within the sub entities. That could be a magnitude of impact, especially if there's no control to go back and review the entries and make sure that each fund or each entity is balanced at the end of an accounting cycle. So that could be a larger magnitude of impact versus just kind of like a one-off entry that was done erroneously, if that makes sense. Okay, continuing on. So based on analysis of each principle, conclude on design, implementation, and effectiveness of each of the 5 components. So we also need to make sure that they're operating together effectively together. If one is lacking or the others aren't operating in an integrated manner, then the system, at large can't be super effective. So some of the benefits and costs are it provides management with added confidence regarding the achievement of objectives and effectiveness of the organization, and also your auditors. So auditors will look at this to ensure that they have some sort of confidence in when they determine how much testing or what kind of testing they do. They look at your internal controls to think about how much they want to rely on your internal controls versus do some more of that detailed testing. So it can actually spare you some work during your audit if you have good internal controls. And it reduces the risks of affecting the achievement of goals, and cost alone is not an acceptable reason to avoid implementing internal controls. Ron, I guess I'll pause there. Is there anything you wanted to add on before I moved on to documentation requirements?
Oh, none at the moment.
Okay.
Summer, got any comments?
No.
I guess
No?
the one thing I'd say is the federal government requires internal controls be in writing to meet the 2 CFR 200 requirements. So I continue to recommend they're in writing.
Oh, really? How so?
What do you mean? That
Like,
it's in the Title 2 of the Code of Federal Regulations.
oh, I mean,
Oh, what do you mean?
oh, like, so do we publish them? Is that like, because I've seen some of them, some of our policies like published.
I think we
So,
get
like,
away with saying our control matrix that we provide to the auditors make the written control documentation requirements.
oh, that's
Schedule-
cool.
Schedule 25s.
Oh,
And-
wow.
And we're, right at the moment, there are a combination of matrices and flowcharts, and we're trying to move to flowcharts.
Mm-hmm.
So 2 CFR 200 is a section of OMB's regulations that governs how you have to manage federal money. So when we received grants from the federal government, everything that we do related to that money, we have to comply with what is laid out in 2 CFR 200.
Wow. There's so much I still don't even know.
I guess the other thing I would add is even though a good internal control system doesn't require written key controls, it's another thing that the federal government or auditor auditing under those standards will often give you a deficiency, like of a low level, if you're not actually writing your controls. Like, for instance, if you okay an invoice for payment and you say that's part of your control system to an invoice for payment, but you don't do anything to actually write down the okay to pay approval, they would maybe give you a lower deficiency in that your control can't really be validated.
Okay.
Yeah, you can look at what we were just written up for. So we, in our management letter, we had, Moss Adams had 2 findings. And one of them is that when you're doing a procurement using federal money, you're supposed to go online to the federal database of debarred vendors and make sure that the vendor that you're doing business with hasn't been debarred by the federal government.
Wow, really?
Yeah. And we missed doing that on a couple. So, but that comes down to documentation also, because I mean, you could do the work and not ever write it down that, oh yeah, I did do that work. And even though you did the work, you would have a finding because you didn't document that you did the work.
So if it's not documented, it didn't happen.
Exactly.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Okay, which is a perfect segue into documentation requirements. So if any principle is not relevant, we need to document how the associated component can be implemented and operate effectively. We need to document internal control system, kind of like Summer was mentioning, through flow charts, or like written walkthroughs. Document the policies and internal control responsibilities of the organization. So who's responsible for what? Evaluate we do it like on a quarterly basis, like we do some reconciliations on a quarterly basis to ensure certain reporting things are occurring as they should. And if not, we're catching them earlier rather than later and correcting those. We should be documenting those internal control issues and determine appropriate corrective action. So kind of like Ron, what you were saying with that procurement issue. Hopefully they're taking steps to make sure that that's incorporated in their new processes going forward. And then document those corrective actions to address those deficiencies and remediate them. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the internal controls as a whole. The environment really has to do, though, with the foundation of the system. This is like the tone at the top. It provides discipline and structure, and it influences how the objectives are defined and how the activities are structured. Oops. There we go. So control environment principles. This is, again, the oversight and management, their demonstration to commitment to integrity and ethical values. It provides oversight over the whole system in terms of organizational structure, responsibility to delegate authority to competent individuals in order to achieve our objectives, and it should demonstrate commitment to recruit, develop, and retain competent personnel, and finally evaluate the performance and hold people accountable as well. So one of the first principles that maps to that tone at the top, at the very top of the 5 components, is a demonstration and commitment to integrity and ethical values. So the following attributes contribute to the design, implementation, and operating effectiveness. Tone at the top, standards of conduct and adherence to the standard of conduct. And I'm curious, Ron or Summer, like in some of the meetings that you have with other managers, do these sorts of things come up and how you all like strategize to communicate this to people on your team? How do you like personally try to ensure that your team knows that this is like really important for you?
Well, I mean, where it comes up most frequently is the operations team and P cards, making sure, you know, because those people are constantly getting pushed on to stretch the definition of what is allowable. So they need to know that Summer and I are going to back them up if they tell a bureau director, no, you cannot do that. That's a violation of policy. So it's critical because there are people in upper levels that want to ignore the rules sometimes or bend the rules. And we have to constantly be reminding them that they are there for a specific purpose to protect us. And that no one is immune or not. There isn't anybody that any of the policies does not apply to.
Right.
So anyway, the people that are evaluating transactions and determining whether to allow them to be paid or not paid need to know that Summer and I are standing behind them, because sometimes they're bumping up against powerful people, and it's
that can be intimidating.
Yeah, and you know, there's usually some good business reason why they're wanting to stretch the rules, but we just, you know, what I keep coming back to is, okay, the rule isn't working, then work with us and we will change the policy and get it to be something that is workable. And that has to happen over time, because how we function as an organization evolves over time.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what it's one of the things that Summer has gotten heavily involved with is like gift cards and
Oh, yeah.
stipends. When I was growing up, when you volunteered, you did not expect compensation. But we've hit an era where people really feel like they should be compensated even though they are a volunteer. So where our policies are in conflict with that, we have to reevaluate those policies and say, okay, well, in these circumstances, following these rules, we can compensate somebody for being on the board, or we can whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the answer isn't just to ignore the rule. The answer is to periodically reevaluate the policies and the rules and make a determination to so whether they need to evolve or not.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I agree with that. That has to do with, constant monitoring. It kind of goes into a loop where, you set the tone at the top and you are enforcing it and doing all these things, but you do kind of have to monitor and reevaluate if those things need to change, but always with the tone at the top that, we're doing the right thing. And I really like that you have that attitude of backing up people, especially when they're in the tough position of enforcing compliance across, various different roles in the organization. So that's pretty key, because if you didn't back them up, then they would have no reason to push back and the whole system fails.
yeah, they would have every reason to protect themselves and ignore the rules, because if nobody's supporting you, anyway, it's critical that the people at the top of the organization, because internal controls are built from the top down.
Mm-hmm.
And if there isn't that strong support from the top, the entire system falls apart.
Yeah. Which is actually exactly what our next slide addresses. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up part 1. But to Ron's point, the tone at the top is the oversight from the top down. It demonstrates the importance of integrity and ethical values. It's management leading by example. So the oversight body and management's directives and attitudes and behaviors reflect integrity and ethical values, or at least they should. And this could be the driver where everybody gets on board, or a barrier if people feel that there's conflicting information coming from the top. And so without adequate tone from the top, risk identification may be incomplete, inappropriate, or certain control activities can start to fall apart, and the whole system breaks down. So anyway, that was a lot for today. We'll go ahead and stop recording.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And it helped me a lot not to have to talk, that you did most of the talking. I appreciate that.
Oh, there's
sorry, I totally hung up on everybody.
Hi.
Am I still recording? Okay, well, the good news is we're still recording.
You can